Hi there, I'm Tevis, and this is Texture Notes, a channel where I talk about the books I've been reading, and the shows I've been watching, and the games I've been playing. For this second video, I want to look back at some of my worst media experiences of 2024, as a kind of companion to my first video on the best of last year. I think it's extremely important to talk about the things that we dislike and why we think those things are bad. I really learn a lot from what I don't like. My own sensibilities and my aesthetics, even my ethics, are made clear to me by the terrible encounters I have with a book or show or game. Sometimes even more than with the things that I love. I also just like to think about the darker, more difficult emotions that can arise with media. The anger, the sadness. We do not talk enough about our sadness. The frustrations and fears, even the disgust. These are all super important. Of course, I do love to talk about pleasure and joy and what moves me, but it just feels incomplete to leave all those other harder feelings out. I do want to say two things up front about this. One, of course, these worsts are my experiences and others will differ. That's the way experience works. I think it will be quite obvious that many people feel differently about what I'm going to discuss here, especially with the books and the games. I think all of this goes without saying, but since I'm new to this space, to YouTube, I'll go ahead and say it. And this leads me to the second thing I want to say, which is, I think these things I dislike are bad. Some extremely bad. I'm not gonna say that they're just not for me, or not to my taste, or in my humble opinion. I'm not going to undercut myself or my experiences in this way, and I don't think anyone else should either. To put it another way, what I dislike and what I think is bad are the same thing. I think this is pretty obvious, perhaps more so for readers of books than players of games. And I do plan to make a separate video at some point that examines this idea, this equality of liking and judgment, in more detail. For now, I hope that these worsts of mine will begin to make this idea a bit clearer. Okay, so first, my worst books of 2024. I don't usually have a long list of these because there's a lot of self-selection involved in what I read, and I don't include books that I've started and then abandoned, of which there are quite a few. A few dishonorable mentions that I will mention and that I did complete include Lauren Euler's tiresome, unstimulating collection of criticism, No Judgment, Heather Fawcett's thin, poorly paced, unromantic fantasy, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and Alcestis by Euripides, which might be the worst Greek play I've ever read. Now, for my three worst books of 2024, these are going to require a little explanation because they're bad in very particular ways. I'm going to briefly cover number 3 because I'm not as interested in it, and then spend a lot more time on the two worst. So, number 3 for me is Reading Genesis by Marilynne Robinson. What this book is a close reading of the first book of the Bible. Now, I've been familiar with Marilynne Robinson for a while, but I only read short pieces of hers, short essays. Never any book-length work, no novels or anything. When I started this, I immediately noticed how gripping her prose was. Her sentences are very precise and confident. They hold you. You can feel the fingers of her sentences kind of leading you from one to the next. And it really made me want to read her novels. I also really liked her thoughtfulness about authorship. You know, there's nothing simple here with a text like Genesis. I first read Genesis in college, not as a religious text, but as, a complex text that was worth, digging into. And she brings to Genesis this authorial sense, one where you love characters, but also have a certain distance from them, a kind of cosmic plan. And I felt like this seemed like a good match for the God of Genesis, for Robinson as an author to really, kind of understand what was going on. But then, the more I read, I found her reading of Genesis to be a very, very bad close reading. It's extremely narrow, it's defensive, And frankly, it's just at times a preposterous book. Robinson will regularly acknowledge problems in Genesis in the text, things that trouble modern readers, and then she just brushes on past them. Even with all her intelligence on display, she has this profound and disturbing ability to just move on. As a believer, as a Calvinist, she's basically unflappable. And this is where her confident prose felt a bit more insidious to me, where its virtues felt like a vice, like literally a stranglehold. Her sentences are so confident about what they should be questioning. They are undeterred where they should be troubled. She just plunges forward past every textual problem where she should be hesitating. The way especially that she handles stories that strike modern eyes as morally repugnant, the story of Isaac and Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, she handles them in such a blinkered way. Her reading is so unbelievable, so often against the plain text of the story, that over time, I just really had a hard time taking her seriously. Also, the more I read, the more her own belief, her monotheism, read to me as really a form of monoculturalism. Throughout reading Genesis, she consistently disparages almost all other ancient texts from the time compared to Genesis. Texts like Gilgamesh. I read Gilgamesh last year because she was shitting on it so regularly, and it ended up being one of my favorites last year. The way she talks about God's chosen people, their specialness, their uniqueness in all the world, it just sounded very familiar to me. Honestly, it sounded like yet another version of American exceptionalism. Our people, our book, our covenant, our God. We are unique in all the world, the exception to every rule. She just follows this kind of exceptionalist logic throughout her reading. Like with American exceptionalism or any monoculturalism, it feels like there is some need at work here, a need for her version to be true. And she just approaches this whole reading Genesis project with a predetermined ending. Her reading is really a foregone conclusion, almost like a textual manifest destiny. I love close reading. It's really my preferred critical mode. But Robinson here really reminded me of the dangers of close reading, the way that it can just lead to self-enclosure, the isolation of your mind, almost like you're in solitary confinement with a text, where you are alone, with all of your needs and illusions, with little to check you. This, to me, is a kind of close reading as a profound form of cultural solipsism. In this case, it means that Robinson's reading of Genesis makes other people's beliefs, other people's covenants, other people's holy books, even all of their texts and stories from the time, like I said, it makes them all somehow less real. This holy book is the only real thing. And that seems to me always the dangers of a holy book, of one book, a book that negates all others. Kind of like the One Ring, it's one book to rule them all, one book to bind them in the darkness. In the end, for me, Robinson just never lays herself on the line. She never tells us what's at stake for her, what it really means for her. She won't allow herself to truly doubt herself or fail. And instead, she does this kind of what I would call maybe a no alarms, no surprises mode of reading. She is not vulnerable, and her reading of Genesis is so desperate that it's not only unsympathetic, but it just feels like a completely failed reading to me. It's insular, it's safe, it's completely non-generative. The beginning of nothing. Now, before I move on, I should give a little context for why I even read this book. Last spring, I was asked to co-teach a kind of Western Civ, Western Humanities class. This is not what I usually teach. I teach a lot of media-based listening and speaking. I taught creative writing last year. I used to teach literature seminars, and I teach debate, though not kind of high school style debates with learning clever rhetorical tricks. I don't teach that. I certainly don't teach the kind of bullshit debates of American conservatives. My students are far more earnest and real in their debates than any of them. To me, real debate should help us, better understand a topic or an issue, and most importantly, better understand our own views on the issue, why we believe what we do. Anyway, I wasn't anxious to teach this Western Civ humanities class. To be honest, if anything, I'm more inclined to teach like an anti-Western Civ class these days. Once I met with my co-teachers, we divided the sections, and I ended up with ancient Greece and Christianity. I'm pretty comfortable teaching Greek epics and tragedies and philosophy, but for Christianity, I knew I would need to prepare a little differently. I did grow up in the church, but I left around the same age as my students, so I thought I could provide a perspective from both the inside and the outside. And I wanted to be fair. I am very critical of Christians these days, especially white evangelicals in America, but I didn't want to focus only on the darkness of Christianity. And so I knew I would need to return to some of the texts themselves. Besides this reading of Genesis, I decided to reread the New Testament to prepare for class. I say reread because I thought that's what I was doing. I did remember reading much of the New Testament in college as a kind of last-ditch effort to salvage my own faith. But I discovered pretty quickly that I was only truly rereading the beginning and the end of the New Testament, the Gospels and Revelation. I had read those before. Everything in between them, I had never read in full. I only knew them in excerpts and quotations. So the letters of Paul, Hebrews, the general epistles, I was reading all of them for the first time. Now, reading the New Testament in full proved to be really crucial, not reading it in excerpts or, the famous verses, but in their own context. Because what I found was all sorts of voices. In excerpts, it's very easy to feel like it's the voice of God. But if you read the full book, each book, what you hear are the voice of people, of particular persons. So, for instance, when I reread Revelation, instead of having, that authority that comes with end times prophecy and stuff, when you read the whole thing, it reads like what it says it is, which is some dude's dream. Like a dream, it is boring, it is overlong, it is ridiculous, and the meaning it just seems like it means something to the dreamer far more than to the person hearing about the dream. When I got to the epistles, the general epistles, I was like, wait, why are these here? Reading them as full letters, they just didn't add much to the New Testament. It almost seemed like filler. When I got to Hebrews, which I'd never read before, Hebrews, is a very rigorous argument, almost in a kind of got a Greek form to it. And it read like no other book in the New Testament. The Gospels too, they when you read them in full, they are very distinct from each other. I kind of remembered this from before, but this time it was very clear. Matthew, it has the worst Jesus. It has the, fire and brimstone, like Old Testament preacher Jesus, the lion, not the lamb. And despite some moments, it really is a harsh book, a harsh gospel to start with. It does not sound at all like the book that follows, Mark, which to me came off as the most believable. Mark has this very plain-spoken, straightforward, unadorned, salt of the earth kind of approach, just the facts. But for an account for a testament that is trying to tell you something that on the face of it is unbelievable, I found this approach made it more believable. It was the most believable gospel. Luke, on the other hand, which I enjoyed in part, but it was far more literary than Mark or Matthew. It felt like a crafted thing, a made thing for a more literate audience. It clearly had different people in mind to try to convince. And it was interesting. I enjoyed some of the literary flourishes, but like I said, it didn't feel like it was just coming from God. It very much felt like a person, a writer, sculpting it. And then there was John. Now, John, when I first read it, it was my favorite gospel, my favorite book of the Bible. It still is. The way it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, very powerful beginning, and that with does so much work. Prepositions are perhaps my favorite part of speech, the way that they tell us position, relationships. They're hard to teach, but everything can turn on a preposition, and John begins so powerfully with that with. And the language of John throughout is the most beautiful. Not beautiful like just in a literary sense like Luke, but The language is so mystical. It is so metaphysical at times. It feels more otherworldly. It feels like not just a guy telling you something. And John has my favorite Jesus, the most human Jesus. Jesus here is chatty. He's worried. He's misunderstood. There are a lot of hilarious scenes where he says something in a kind of heightened way, and the people take it more literally. He meets a woman at one point where he says to her something like, "Drink of the waters of life, drink deeply of me." And she says to him kind of plainly, "Sir, our well is dry." And the contrast between the people and Jesus and the language and the situations, it's funny, and it's really enjoyable. The book is kind of cute even. The end of John ends by saying, and Jesus did so many other things. If we tried to say all of them, there wouldn't be enough books on earth to capture them all, which, okay. It's sweet. John captures kind of the two elements of Christianity that I respond to most, that being mystical Christianity as a deeply mysterious thing, as something that looks at life as a mystery and tries to grapple with it. And then also Christianity as a response to human suffering. And this is present in all of the Gospels in some way, especially here. You really feel throughout the Gospels, the people, when they come to Jesus, you can feel their suffering. You can feel their vulnerability. You can feel how in their pain, their own pain, but often the pain of a family member who is sick, a child who is sick, their desperation, their reaching out to him, just touch the hem of his garment, right? I could really feel that in the Gospels, and found it quite moving often. So John has that, and the mystical tradition. It's a very powerful book. It remains my favorite. I was on this high with John when I moved through Acts of the Apostles to reach the letters of Paul, which I was reading for the first time. Now, before I get into Paul, because Paul's letters are my second worst reading experience of the year, I want to just say briefly kind of how I approach history, how I approach ancient texts, if it's not already obvious. I say this to my students too. When we read an old book, I think there's a few mistakes that we can make. Common is to look up too much to it, to treat the book or the people in it as better than us. This to me is a very conservative approach, and one I do not do. We can make the kind of opposite mistake of looking down on them, as if the people there are worse, more ignorant, behind, outdated. This to me speaks of a kind of false notion of progress, as if we know we're so much better now when we are not. So no looking up, no looking down, and also I don't want to look from a distance, to look at something and be like, oh, that's too far away in time or space. I can't be the judge of that, right? It's beyond my judgment. This is a kind of academic position, this distance, and I don't read this way. And I don't suggest to my undergraduates they read ancient texts this way either. Instead, I like to approach ancient books as an equal. These are books by and about our sisters and brothers. I read them for fellowship, for communion with people who were once on this earth, like we are now. I read them as equals. I want to listen to them. I want to feel with them and for them. I want to face them. And if they push me with some bullshit, as a reader, I want to push back. I read old books because I want to connect to people who are both recognizably human, familiar, and who are distant in time or space or culture, and thus kind of alien. I want to experience the familiar and the alien both together in the people of the past. So, who did I encounter here in Paul as an equal? And why were his letters my second worst reading experience of the year? Now, to be clear, when I say Paul, I'm talking about the voice of the text, not the historical person. I am not a historian, certainly not a biblical scholar, and when reading the letters of Paul last spring, I didn't get super bogged down in authorship. So I'm counting all the widely accepted letters in the New Testament and the more disputed ones, because I read them all together and I felt a common project between them. Even with the more disputed letters that admittedly lacked a little bit of his style, I don't think there's much in them that really contradicts the more canonical ones. So Paul, for me, is the spirit animating these letters, the style and voice and tendencies, the character. I treat this character as a person and call them Paul, even if some of the letters were written by others in his spirit. I do this because it was really the voice that struck me reading these letters. It was not the content, which I was already vaguely familiar with. I just found a recognizable style to these letters, in the thinking, the personality, the prose, that I responded to very strongly. At first, I found Paul's voice very charismatic. His first letters are warm and energetic. At the end of Romans, he thanks all of the people that hosted him. It's quite endearing, the people he names and the shout-outs he gives. And his style of writing is cute. His style of argument, he will bring up an issue, a question people ask, does the Gospels mean this? And he'll say, not at all, by no means. It's kind of sweet. His letters are well written overall. He uses vivid language. The feelings are quite dynamic. You can really feel them. The rhetorical devices quite pointed. It's not stiff, and overly holy, but funny, kind of saucy. Paul's got a big personality. There's a point where he's criticizing people for following him too closely, the divisions that arise between different preachers. And he says, was Paul crucified for you? Not Jesus. He can say things in quite a dramatic way. He's very human, very proud, very self-pitying. He gets all huffy at sometimes when people compare their suffering to his. There's a part where he says, are they, these others, servants of Christ? I am more. And then in parentheses, he says, I'm out of my mind to talk like this. That's a verse I never hear quoted. I am more. I worked harder. I've been imprisoned more often, flogged more severely. He's also very sensitive and kind of scorned in responding to his haters. There's a part where he says, I've made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. Again, I don't hear that verse quoted as often. But for all this charisma, over time, like with many big personalities, Paul becomes overbearing. He becomes tiresome. And his hobby horses become all too clear. He is absolutely obsessed with women. He has stricter opinions about women covering their hair than about men getting circumcised. He has this terrifying love of order. And he sees women as not only the cause of original sin, but an element of chaos in the present that must be controlled. He gives extensive advice on regulating widows, especially young ones, and it's all presented as a way of maintaining order. His rhetoric becomes tiresome too. He'll ask these kind of fake Socratic questions, but then give his very Paul answers. Always one correct way, one answer. And he constantly is kind of raising the temperature of his prose with end times thinking. All the panic and justification that comes with thinking it's the end of days. There's no time to think in these, decadent and godless final days. You must accept. He really has kind of strong old man yells at cloud vibes. And his apocalyptic thinking and his authoritarian attitude kind of feel like they go hand in hand. He presents the world as a single solution puzzle, and Christianity as the one answer. Again, it's like Robinson. It's the same kind of tedious monologic. It was really the more that I read of him as the letters accrued. He wasn't just charismatic and tiresome, but his project became clear to me. Paul was not writing, to inspire, to educate, or even to save souls, really. Paul's project was to build the church. His project was fundamentally political. And in this, I finally began to see not charismatic Paul, and like I said, not even tiresome Paul, but Paul the asshole. Paul the unrepentant asshole. And it's not just that he's extremely misogynist and anti-queer, that he repeatedly justifies slavery. I knew these things going in. But like I said, what was new to me was his voice, his person in presenting these things, his project. This was not transformative Christian revolution, the last shall be first and the first last. This was real politics. This was delayed justice and forced unity so that the church could be established here on earth. This was bringing all Christians, especially the women, under control so as to make Christianity palatable to earthly authorities. I mean, his entire apologetics for slavery is built on these real politics. He says at one point that enslaved people shouldn't cause trouble, quote, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. He's saying, don't hurt our reputation. I mean, I hear in this echoes of modern Democrats and their abandonment of trans people, any group that they imagine will hurt their electoral prospects. Paul's got the same idea. He says slaves should be taught to please, quote, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. Slavery is not just about obedience, but about obeying with a sincere heart. You must accept your position, accept your oppression, and crucially, you must like it. Paul's letters are not the inspired word of God. No God worth following would endorse this. Paul's letters are just propaganda. And it was his political project and his propaganda towards those ends that reminded me of someone else, that being the modern Christian. Some people look at modern Christianity, what it's become, and they say, oh, no, that's not true Christianity. I mean, I even once argued this back in 2016 when they supported Trump in his first term. But if you read Paul, it's all there. You're forced to admit, no, actually, this is Christianity. Jesus' words and life in the Gospels weren't enough. No, we needed more. We needed Paul. And all those other books of the New Testament. It's not enough to be followers of Christ. You need to be Christians, your church established here on earth. Not a belief, not salvation, certainly not an ethics, but a movement, a political body, a social club. It's not just the doctrine here, the substance. It's the style, the mindset, the voice that echoes across the ages to me, and I can still hear it today. You can hear in Paul that terrifying love of order, that self-pity and victimhood, that desire above all else to win, always to win. Victory in Jesus, except they could not wait for his return. And in order to win, Paul demands just one thing, agreement. The central Christian virtue here is submission. There is one way, one answer. It is monological. It is monocultural. It all only goes in one direction. It's freedom for me, Paul, chains for you. We've heard this before, right? Free speech for me, no speech for you. Personality for me, impersonal drone life for you. You, the person, are not even necessary. Paul, in the modern Christian, only needs your submission. Paul's voice is in the end just terrible. Terrifying, really, precisely because it is so charismatic and so familiar. And I know this all sounds pretty bad, so why is this not my worst book of the year, my worst reading experience of the year? Well, for one, I'm not judging worst on historical impact or harm to the world. I certainly don't think my worst book is harming the world. And I'm not even really willing to put all the blame on Paul for that harm. Those who kept him alive over all the years, and his millions of descendants today share in that blame. The question for me in thinking about the worst is pretty simple. What was my worst experience with the book? What was the most painful to read? The most despair-inducing? What hit the closest to home? This was not Paul, who was not painful to read, and who did induce despair, but it was about the world, not about myself. He doesn't hit close to home for me in that way. Some years my worst is a companion to my best, a kind of counterpoint or dark reflection. And much of what I dislike in my worst book is a direct contradiction of what I liked about my best book, Sheila Heti's Alphabetical Diaries. I'm gonna try to make that clear. Anyway, the worst book I read in 2024 was Immediacy by Anna Kornblue. This is an academic book written for a general audience. And I read it because its thesis that immediacy, this word, immediacy, is a mega category for understanding our world. This was interesting to me. I'm obsessed with time, with our experience of time, with real time. And whether I agreed with all of its ideas or not, a book-long meditation on immediacy sounded cool. But then I read it. And dear God, the writing in this book. This was by far the most excruciating prose I read all year. The writing was not just dense and anxious and full of that, specialized academic vocabulary, though it was that. And it wasn't just that thing, that academic thing where you say something simple in the most convoluted way possible, though it does that too. No, on top of this, the writing here tries to be cool, cute even. Most paragraphs are full of these tortured phrases and then end with some quip or meme. But these quips were never funny. They were never any fun because Kornblue's language is so constantly scolding everything it touches. The book has this bullying prose style. It's pungent. It's pitiless. It's a harangue, really. And I found it unbearable. I do think this is very bad writing, but I wouldn't necessarily call the author a bad writer. There's a clear intelligence and sensitivity here, even in the language. But like with so many academics, that intelligence and sensitivity are totally misused. The writing wants to both have the authority of academia, of systems thinking, of the authority of objectivity. I mean, she uses this word, objectivity, unironically. But it also wants to have the flavor and style and overbearingness of the personal. And you just can't have both, at least not like this. The personal is necessarily circumscribed. It's provisional, given to doubt. It can't appeal to some institutional authority or citations or some false objectivity to give it power. Well, when it does, it just comes off as insufferable. The writing here is like the polar opposite of Sheila Heti's in Alphabetical Diaries. Her sentences are clear and deep. She claims no authority but her own as a person. She is earnest and vulnerable and honest about her feelings. And her sentences are just always open and curious. They bully no one. Even if I could stomach these sentences, the actual claims of the book are completely unsupported, completely unconvincing to me. I came away with no sense that immediacy is some master category for our world. Even the term immediacy never gets a clear definition that distinguishes it from, a kind of presentism or nowism or really modernism. Historically, her use of this word barely makes any sense to me. Her method of proving this category across different modes, there's chapters on immediacy in language, in images, video, theory. Her method is all generalizations and assumptions. For instance, she provides like a list of qualities or effects that something she hates has, like autofiction, which Sheila Heti is considered a part of. She hates this, and so she will just list its qualities or effects and assume that the list is self-evidently bad, as if it requires no explanation or argument. There's just very little analysis or argument at all in the book, and thus her conclusions are completely unearned. The book has just a very superficial understanding of anything outside its social and cultural theories. It uses outdated notions of the mind and body. It dismisses whole areas of biology and phenomenology without seeming to understand them. Even its use of the word media, which it uses set against immediacy, as if immediacy negates mediation, as if that were even possible. It just seems completely wrong-headed to me. The book offers no real engagement either with the media that horrifies her in all of its immediacy. It just offers these very glib readings en masse. The book has no actual feel for a single piece of media, a single work of art. It is the opposite of a close reading. The whole book is honestly just kind of like an internet article, one of those internet articles about the internet, about the pace and quality of modern life Things are moving too fast. We need to slow down and reflect more. Get some distance. She means academic distance. Which, all right, sure. But it's something we've heard a million times before, and it doesn't need to be all gussied up like this in this tortured academic language. To me, there's just a contradiction at the heart of this book, a really deep failure that bothers me even more than the writing and the thesis and the method. And the contradiction is this. Immediacy argues against the personal, against the subjective. And it does this while Kornblue's own personality is bursting forth on every page. The book argues against immediacy as this overwhelming mode of modern experience, and it argues this by then overwhelming the reader with a dense, bullying, present tense style that feels like the very thing she's criticizing. In other words, this book is guilty of the thing it hates. It is dominated by the very thing, the irrepressible self, in all of its immediacy, that it hates. It's almost like it hates and loves immediacy, like it hates and loves itself, you know. I don't know why I keep thinking of Lord of the Rings references with these books. Anyway, I kept thinking while I was reading, no one with this much personality should be arguing against the personal. No one with this much attitude should be arguing against subjectivity. It's like she tried to get outside of everything, outside of every system of society, ideology, and yet she so clearly could not get outside of herself, you know, just like the rest of us. I could almost sympathize with this. If this book, like so many, is arguing with itself, writing against itself, then okay. Maybe her next book will find a way through this contradiction. It will find a new style, or maybe just stop fighting itself and find a new way to be as a person, as a writer with a strong personality. But for now, this book remains, for me, just a complete and total failure. A failure of awareness, a failure of honesty, really a full-on denial of the self. You know, Hetty's alphabetical diaries in my reading also attempted to escape the self, like immediacy seems to be doing, though Hetty's not trying to escape subjectivity. And Hetty also found that you couldn't really escape this. You couldn't really do this. But alphabetical diaries was far more honest, far more curious, far less overreaching, and found a far better method through the constraint of alphabetization for seeing yourself anew. Hetty goes, all in with subjectivity. She goes so in as to go through it. And this feels far more revelatory to me than imagining some objective world of theory that you might take refuge in. Because to me, this is what Kornblue really cares about, theory in the academic sense. She has a chapter called Anti-Theory, where she discusses what immediacy does to theory. And this is where she gets really heated. The heyday of critical theory in academia seems to be passing, and she hates this. She doesn't admit to loving many things. She's rarely that vulnerable. But she clearly loves Frederick Jameson. And this book reads at times like a defensive hymn, kind of an update. Which again, I can understand a bit. I mean, Jameson's cool. It's kind of sweet to do this. But it just doesn't work. Kornblue is writing as if completely under siege. So defensive. Immediacy, this thing called immediacy, almost feels like a kind of apocalypse to her. There's a kind of end times thinking shot through the whole book, not unlike Paul. For many people, it just seems like it's always the end times, even though time never ends. It only ends for you, for us. The now will continue without us. This immediacy will outlive us. Every day this becomes clearer, and yet I know it doesn't get any easier to accept. I think, though, what kept me from ultimately sympathizing with this book and kind of letting it off the hook was two things. One, this book seems to hate people. There are constant little cheap shots, constant sneering and looking down on everything. Like that line in Andor where Luthen says to Dedra, "There's a whole universe out there waiting to disgust you." This book seems disgusted by so much of the world. There's just this disdain for people and the smallness of our lives throughout it. At one point, she refers to our bodies as as a stupid envelope. And I was wondering if Mr. Smith from the Matrix had suddenly showed up, like stepped up to give a monologue about how gross humans are and our meatiness, our meat bodies. There's also in the book this weird fascination with power, even in the power of its prose, the wielding of that power. One of the only shows she admits to liking is Succession. And it seemed like, even if her politics are leftist, her voice here, personality-wise, style-wise, it felt awfully conservative to me. My second favorite book last year that I discussed in my last video was Studs Terkel's Working. And that book had this profound love of people running through it, which I just loved. And Immediacy really feels like the opposite of that. The second thing that kept me from letting this book go, letting it off, was more personal, though. And that was that I almost went down this road, too. Academically, I mean. When I was in grad school for literature and media, I struggled to combine my personality, my subjectivity, with the demands of academic prose. The specialized diction, the twisted syntax, the constant demands to incorporate theory. The audience, the presumed audience of your hungry peers. And just this general anxiety that infected my writing at the very deepest levels. I found it ruinous. And I've spent years trying to scrub the taint of academia from my writing. I can still feel it there sometimes, no matter how I've tried to move beyond it. Now, content-wise, I could never write a book like this. I don't agree with any of it. But I met many people in grad school who could have. They were fellow students who loved theory, but could hardly name a novel or poem or film that inspired them, that they loved. They wanted to always stand outside of everything, above it all, never show themselves or risk much. They dodged expressing any vulnerability. And admittedly, academia is not kind to vulnerability. I had to leave my grad program in the end before even completing it. And I've just never really regretted that. I just couldn't be the person I wanted to be there. I actually came to China for the first time shortly after, where I could be the person I wanted to be, or at least a bit closer to that person. Anyway, reading this book, it was like an alarm blaring, a warning, for a path that I almost took, almost a ghost of what, writing-wise, I might have become. Its failure of awareness, of honesty, it could have been mine. It could still be mine. Those dangers, never go away. So, much more than Paul, this book just sent shivers through me. And so it was easily, overwhelmingly, the worst book I read last year. Okay, now I want to switch gears completely, talk about something very different. The worst shows that I watched last year. Now, I don't have very many of these, partly because I got lucky, I suppose. I didn't encounter as many shows that I really hated. Even my worst show of last year, I've already seen 5 shows this year that are all worse than that. Also, because I kind of chose last year not to hate watch anything. There were a few shows that I had not enjoyed and I could have continued with. The second season of The Bear I thought was quite bad. The final episode I found embarrassing. And I was like, I'm not going to continue with that show and just hate on it. Even a show that I sometimes liked, Star Trek Discovery, it had its final season last year. I was curious, but man, that show can be so bad sometimes that I just didn't have it in me to go there. So I'm going to quickly mention 2 shows that I didn't like and then talk a little bit about the worst, though even now my feelings have changed a bit on it. Those other 2 shows I disliked. One was an anime called A Sign of Affection. This is the second piece of Japanese media that I've felt mishandled deafness. I saw A Silent Voice a few years ago, and I think its handling is much worse, but here this love story between this dude and a girl who is deaf. I don't think it handles it very well. I also find the guy to be so creepy. He's like a tourist, interested in all these experiences of the world, including the experience of deafness. I thought the show was criticizing it at some points, but by the end, at least of the first season, I don't see that. Yeah, it just totally doesn't work. I sometimes worry, like, I keep trying romances and not liking them and thinking, oh, do I not like romance? But actually, I'm at this very moment in the middle of watching another anime, His and Her Circumstances, very romantic, wonderful. I mean, I'm halfway through it. So far, it is amazing. So, no, just not a sign of affection. Also, the 4th season and final season of My Brilliant Friend I watched last year and was so disappointed with this. I loved the first few seasons. I particularly love Leela, the true My Brilliant Friend of the title. She's one of my favorite characters of the last few years, and I love her relationship with Lenu. And whenever the show focuses on that, like it did in the 1st and 2nd season, I just think the show's amazing. But in this last season, the pacing was so off. It wasted so much time on Nino, fucking Nino, this terrible and typical dude. Ugh. It wasted so much time on him instead of focusing on Leela and Lenu. And even the title, The Story of the Lost Child, is the subtitle of this. It waited until like the last 2 or 3 episodes to even address this. It just didn't, to me, do right by Leela in the end, and it was just so disappointing. I had planned to read the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante that this is based on right after it, but the ending was so deflating that I kind of hesitated. I still probably will read them. I've loved 2 of her books that I've read, The Lying Life of Adults and Days of Abandonment, and I hope that the books don't end like the show does, but oh man, so disappointing. Now, the worst show of 2024 for me is something that I have softened a bit on. I watched it with my daughter last fall, and I've seen more seasons since then, and I've even seen my daughter kind of take some of its lessons and try to use them in her life in a very sweet way, so she likes the show quite a bit. The show is Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Now, content-wise, what it's about, the lessons that it is so eager to impart, I agree with many of those. You know, like it's not wrong about children, about how to be a child in the world. But agreement doesn't go very far with me, especially when it's didactic like this. You know, Star Trek Discovery, which I didn't watch, but I had before. I couldn't stand it in part, not because I didn't agree with it. I agree with it so often. And yet it's so heavy-handed and so leads to such like actual bad drama. It's really, sometimes I think of Discovery like it's the Daniel Tiger of science fiction, the Daniel Tiger of space shows. Anyway, Daniel Tiger, despite whatever agreement I might have with its ideas, it presents them with absolutely no humor whatsoever. There's no spark or fire. And this is not just versus other shows like Bluey. You know, Bluey was my favorite show of last year. There are no shows like Bluey. I don't expect that. But comparing Daniel Tiger even to other things that I saw with my daughter, Peppa Pig, Super Kitties, My Little Pony, she's watching now, Taupe, the little mole. This is from the 70s. It's a Czech show. Very, very charming. Even compared to all these other shows, it has no life to it to me. Part of the problem is Daniel himself. I have never wanted to punch a little tiger in the face as much as I do with him. Oh, he whines about every little thing. His voice. Oh, I find it unbearable. At one point I asked my partner, is this a show about an annoying child? Is this like helping parents with annoying children? Because my daughter is difficult sometimes, but she's not annoying. Maybe parents don't find their own children annoying, but Daniel, dear God, everything's a crisis. Everything, it's not about expressing his feelings. He just gets so into his feelings in a way that's so off-putting and indulgent. You just want to be like, get a grip, guy. Ah, man. And because he serves as your guide in the show. He's the narrator. He's the Mr. Rogers position. He's in the Mr. Rogers position. Oh, it just doesn't work. You can't just, this is a spinoff of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and you can't just transpose everything from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood into like this updated version without some real serious problems. For instance, Mr. Rogers is about a neighborhood. This is called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, but it's really about his family and friends, not neighbors, strangers. This is going from a kind of progressive neighborhood structure to a more conservative family and friends structure, not strangers, kin. And I don't think that works. Mr. Rogers, he kind of presented this image of a man against the typical stranger danger. The idea of going, to visit a single adult man with no apparent family of his own in their house, spending time, this is something that sets off most people's alarms. But Mr. Rogers was cut so against that. He was in an alternate vision of what an adult man, a neighbor, not a relative, a stranger could be. He was radical, his gentleness, his strength, the way he listened, the way he paid attention to you, the viewer. And a little tiger, a peer, cannot really do this. They cannot fill this role and serve that same function. A companion, sure, Daniel can be your companion, but not your guide. Mr. Rogers radiates this gentle strength and care, and a little kid it cannot really do that. You cannot replace a singular presence like Fred Rogers with a whiny animated tiger and expect it to work. There's a conceptual problem here, as well as one of execution. Beyond this problem of trying to modernize Mr. Rogers in this way, the show, I think, suffers from a real kind of solipsism, for lack of a better word. The adults in Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood appear to have been shot with horse tranquilizers. They are like zombies walking through. They never raise their voice, never show any strong emotion, never show any personality. They are just there for the children. And I found this so disrespectful of adult life, as if only a child's world is real. Bluey doesn't do this at all. At all. Everyone's real in Bluey. But here, it's only Daniel and his classmates and their world that's real. And besides finding it off-putting, I don't even find it true to children's lives. My daughter is actually very interested in my feelings, in my partner's feelings. She asks us. She cares about our lives. She's very inclusive and doesn't want anyone to be left out. She doesn't just want us to serve her and, never show any feelings. Children learn from watching, not just from what you tell them. And I don't know what the adults in Daniel Tiger are showing Daniel, are teaching him to be, except to, walk through life tranquilized. My daughter does like this show. She still watches it. I've seen more of it and have softened a bit. I'm glad she likes it. She can decide for herself what she likes. It doesn't need to be something that I like also. And she will continue to watch it, and maybe I'll soften even more. But for now, whenever I hear Daniel's little tiger voice, I still shudder. I have to get away before I say something around her that I shouldn't. And so it ended up being the worst show I watched last year, even though, like I said, I've already watched 5 shows this year far worse. Okay, now I want to talk about the worst games I played last year. Like with my books, I had a lot of feelings about the worst games, and so this section's going to be pretty long, like that one. And like with my video about the best games I played, I'm going to pretty quickly, go through numbers 5, 4, and 3, and then spend more time on the worst 2. So first, the 5th worst game that I played last year was the Elden Ring DLC Shadow of the Erdtree. Now, I don't usually play a lot of DLC, but I really, really liked Elden Ring a few years ago, and I was hoping that the DLC would somehow further explore that game's strengths, its virtues. I felt Elden Ring was a game that was fundamentally wide. Its world was wide, not over-designed or sequenced. Its role-playing was wide. It allowed me to experiment with my character over time. And I thought its approach to difficulty was wide. This was very welcome. It gave me many options to handle or, in some cases, ignore its challenges. And I just felt this wideness was a really welcome change from the increasing narrowness that I'd found in FromSoft games the past decade. Dark Souls 3 was really a very narrow rut of a game to me, so repetitive and self-obsessed. And especially Sekiro, I found that game incredibly narrow, so test-like, so mastery-focused, so one way, one correct way. So I was hoping that Shadow of the Erdtree was going to follow Elden Ring's wideness and not fall back into some of FromSoft's old habits. But I found that Shadow of the Erdtree was a funnel in many familiar ways, and it was fundamentally more in the way that so much DLC is, just more. I will say the map of Shadow of the Erdtree is extremely cool. It's one of the coolest maps I think FromSoft has ever made. It's layered in every direction, very knotted. It twists in and around itself constantly. But the map also kind of proved to me that having a cool map is just not enough. Perhaps because it's just that. It's a map. It's not really a world like that in the original Elden Ring. That world was wide and sprawling, shambling, excessive. And here in Erdtree, the map is a hyper-designed thing. Overtly so. It's a design that you can feel in all of its cleverness and its coolness. This can work. This kind of map can work on a smaller scale. I thought of the little micro-worlds in Demon Souls. In some ways, the Erdtree map is like a giant Demon Souls map. But I think scale really matters here. The kind of design that you can accept and enjoy in a contained space, a castle, a dungeon, a prison, is not the same kind that you can accept in a world. They do different things, a narrow indoors and a wide outdoors. They push and pull you in different ways. But Shadow of the Erdtree is really an indoor space wearing the skin of an outdoor one. It's a giant dungeon decorated with the wallpaper of a world. What especially killed this map for me was Torrent, my horse. I felt Torrent was one of the worst things about the original Elden Ring. Torrent trivialized the landscape, flattened and shrunk it, and allowed you to just kind of glide along the surface. You didn't have to be in the landscape. And there were so many beautiful and brutal parts of the Erdtree map that I just ended up racing through on Torrent. Because I could. The game shouldn't have let me. It should have been designed without a horse like Torrent in mind. But I fell back on Torrent mostly because the difficulty of Erdtree was uninteresting. I'd faced many challenges like this before, with this very same character in Elden Ring, and it just quickly became tedious. The difficulty of Erdtree was just more. I also fell back on Torrent because there was hardly any incentive to scour the landscape. There was very little real treasure to find outside the Shadru tree fragments, which were not that hidden. All the stuff, all the treasure, all the armor and weapons, it was just more of the same. To spend 40 hours in a dungeon world with tricks and traps that are all too familiar to me at this point, with useless treasure, and with a really enforced narrowness of approach, despite how it looks. I just couldn't see the point. In the game, I began to think of the problem as the too-late-ness of the world. It was too late in this world. Not too late in the usual FromSoft world, that feeling of ruin of a world that cannot be saved. But too late as in too late for my character, too late for me. Elden Ring was a generous game, and I really took it up on its kind of weird hospitality, and I role-played the shit out of that game. But when I arrived in Erdtree, the role-playing was already over. There was nothing left to do. My character was flat now. She was a known quantity, a finished thing. There were few truly new options to explore, especially with my character already spec'd a certain way. And the game's difficulty, overwhelming but uninteresting, it meant that experimentation wasn't really encouraged. I just needed to survive. Which meant focusing on finding those shadow tree fragments, which were really just a kind of across-the-board power leveling, to scale me up to the DLC world. But it was too late in the life cycle of my character to bring any real changes, to grow in any meaningful or compelling way. It was just too late. And this feeling of too-late-ness in my mind, it really came to define my whole experience with Shadow of the Erdtree. I think a lot of DLC suffers from this feeling of too-late-ness, where there's no real point except to repeat yourself again and again, do more of the same, like most sequels do, which Shadow of the Erdtree almost is a sequel. Anyway, by the end, despite there was one cool NPC encounter right before the end, this feeling of too-late-ness was just completely overwhelming for me. It was my dominant feeling. And it made the whole game just feel completely pointless to me in the end. With my next game, the fourth worst game I played last year, Balatro, it wasn't exactly the point that was the problem, but the fact that whenever I played Balatro, I always came away unsatisfied. Every game, whether I won or whether I lost, I was always so unsatisfied. The first time I played Balatro, I really felt like I just lost time. I don't know, like 30 or 45 minutes were just gone. When I came up for air after that first game, I had two thoughts. One, oh, I can see why everyone's been talking about this. And then two, get away from me, Satan. My God, the grip of this game. This never changed, no matter how many times I played. And given how slow and methodically I do play, as I unlocked more jokers and lasted longer, a whole hour and a half could just disappear, just completely gone. At the beginning, I could kind of accept feeling unsatisfied because I was mostly losing. I do like poker, I like solitaire, I like randomness, so I thought I just needed to, stick with it. I thought, maybe winning will feel different. Except no, winning was almost more unsatisfying. It felt really hollow. And then, because I won, the game asked me if I wanted to keep going. And of course I did. Like with so many games, I wanted to see how far I could go. But pretty soon the numbers would go crazy and I would go from dramatically overpowered to supremely underpowered in the span of like one round. Again, I felt so unsatisfied. My wins and my losses were almost never tight. There was rarely that drama. Instead, I really began to understand how much my score depended on the jokers and how I needed to keep playing to keep unlocking more powerful jokers. When my strategies would get stale, when I relied on straights too much, I saw that what I needed to do was unlock new decks, to play new modes with new constraints, to unlock more jokers to get a higher and higher score. And I did this for a while. But like I said, win or lose, satisfaction never came. I need a game to be fulfilling on its own. I need it to give me something, some satisfaction, or at least an interesting dissatisfaction, not just keep me playing forever. I always need an off-ramp in a game. Balatro reminded me of an old internet post from maybe 10 years ago or so. I think it was about the game Her Story, which asks you to scour a video database. It's all out of order. You scour it for clues and decide for yourself when you figured its mystery out, when you've seen enough. The post that I was reminded of basically asked other people this question about Her Story. How do I know when I'm satisfied? I remember some people kind of making fun of this poster, but I think it's a really central question for video games, especially those that have no clear ending. How do I know when I'm satisfied? It's a question I don't think a lot of games want us to ask. They're in fact designed around chasing a satisfaction that never fully arrives. Because if it arrives, you might stop playing. It feels sometimes like all my life, games have been chasing something. Newer technology or higher graphic fidelity, prestige and respect, always the promise of something bigger and better. With Balatro, it doesn't hide this chase, this never arriving satisfaction. The game really lays itself bare. It's almost impressive how naked this game is. The game, Balatro, really just felt like a video game as a kind of elaborate tease, drawing me into this like almost erotics of ever escalating numbers, bigger and bigger, more and more, never to be dissatisfied, by design. I just had to walk away from Balatro after a few weeks. The game left me ragged and strung out, almost feeling sneaky as I tried to fit in another round. There was clearly no consummation to be had. So it ended up really being my worst near addiction of 2024, my worst close call. My third worst game of 2024 was Animal Well. I'm going to have to keep this one short because my problem with most puzzle games really needs its own video. One day I may do that, but not today. I'll just say that Animal Well is a very simple game at heart. It's a series of limited solution puzzle rooms spread over a Metroidvania-like space. In other words, a Puzzlevania. After I finished it, I saw people talking about this game as if it were this deeply mysterious thing, this complex video game object with all of these layers. Layers was the word. This was kind of used in the marketing, as in like lasagna layers. And I saw people using these afterwards. But are these layers in the game? No. The first layer was said to be all the main puzzles and items to complete the game for the first time. And I was like, oh, you mean the main quest? The second layer was supposedly all the extras you could find, literal Easter eggs in more out-of-the-way locations off the main path. And I was like, we call these collectibles and side quests, not some second layer. The third layer were supposed to be the big mysteries, the puzzles that took place either over larger portions of the map or required multiple players to solve together, socially. In other words, the metagame. To me, to call these completely bog-standard things, main quests, side quests and collectibles, the metagame, to call them layers in this mystery, it's not only preposterous, but it speaks to my whole experience of the game. That being, a supposedly mysterious wrapper around a completely standard video game. And I hate this. I hate moody graphics around a vanilla core, like with Playdead's Limbo. I hate pretty wallpaper in a boring puzzle room, like with Cocoon. I especially hate games that try to conflate mystery with puzzles. And this game does this. The graphics here, well done as they are by its solo developer, they just scream mystery. But the gameplay and the puzzles are utterly mundane. I would so rather it be the opposite, where the game looks all normie and basic, but hides its weirdness, some actual strangeness inside an unassuming look. The actual experience of playing Animal Well is so unstimulating, no matter what the graphics promise, no matter how they flirt with the mystery center of my brain. The graphics actually end up being very one note. You can never tell where you are exactly because every screen looks beautiful and every screen looks the same. The items are at first seemingly interesting. There's a yo-yo, a frisbee, but what they're actually used for is completely uninteresting. It's just items for puzzles on puzzles on puzzles. And each item has multiple uses for multiple kinds of puzzles. And moving through a Metroidvania-like space where traversal depends on puzzle solving and resolving, especially when you die and return to a checkpoint, it feels crazy to me to have to solve the same simple puzzles multiple times. This isn't even a hard game, but anytime I had to resolve a puzzle I'd already done, I was like, what? It's all just so incredibly tedious. And the idea that once you beat the main game, the first layer, that you would want to re-scour the map to find all the eggs, retraverse all these kind of knotted puzzle spaces, I don't know, that just feels crazy to me. I don't know why any of this is supposed to be interesting. This is just a puzzle box world. It's a feat of engineering, but also a dead space, a kind of pre-digested space. Your only task here is to reverse engineer everything, to play your part as the cog in its very over-designed machine. And so I found Animal Well, like most puzzle games, to be dull, tedious, and profoundly unmysterious. When I started thinking about the very worst game of last year, it always came down to two possibilities for me. At the end of the year, I knew there were two that I disliked far more than the three I just mentioned. One was a game of nearly all lows. It was a game I took so little pleasure in, despite it having a reputation for joy. I enjoyed maybe 15, 20 minutes out of its 10 or 15 hours that I played it. The other game was a very long game of some real highs and many serious lows, especially at the end. But it had a range of emotions throughout its 100 hours that I played. It was a very long game. A basic calculation, an average, would make it sound like the first game was worse, the game of nearly all lows. But the thing is, I do not care about the first game, and I do care a lot about the second. The second game's badness pains me in a way that the first, in all of its dullness, simply cannot. There are all kinds of bad, but the question for me is, which do I care about most? Which means that the second worst game of 2024, the one I care about less, is Astrobot. Now I'm aware. Astrobot is the most widely praised and beloved game of last year. Some years I am completely out of sync with other players. Many years, actually. 2024 was definitely one of those years. And amidst, all the overwhelming praise of Astrobot, I heard a few criticisms. I heard people criticize its bland, clean art style, that had no identity of its own, that it was just, a blank canvas to project what is basically corporate propaganda. And yes, that's true. I didn't like those aspects either. I cannot celebrate a company or a system or even a game series I enjoyed. Not like this. But honestly, this is not what really bothers me about Astrobot. I hate Astrobot because I think it's a bad platformer. I'm saying this as someone with a long history of loving platformers. One of the first games I remember loving was a Smurf game on the Atari 2600, a very rudimentary platformer. But even outside that, there was a game on The Price is Right, where a little guy would be trying to climb a mountain in a 2D view. I found fascinating. I always, when riding in a car, like to look out the window at the landscape passing by, imagining moving through it at speed. And then Super Mario Brothers, like it was for many people, was a revelation to me. I saw it for the first time at a Pizza Hut. I'd never experienced in a game that sense of embodiment, that real sense of space or world like I did in Super Mario Brothers. And I became fascinated by the fundamentals of 2D landscapes, the way they develop, that parallax scrolling, a 3D look on a 2D screen. I played all sorts of 8-bit and 16-bit platformers, and I developed opinions. I much preferred Mario over Sonic. I thought Super Mario 3 was way better than Super Mario World. And then when it went 3D, that revolution, Mario 64, I was astonished by it, by the possibilities in its platforming. Even as late as Super Mario Galaxy 2, Super Mario 3D Land, I still felt like platformers were central to gaming. Admittedly, platformers feel less prominent now, less vital, but still, there are really interesting ones. Last year, I played Pepper Grinder, a really terrific little platformer. I played Mosalina, which randomizes your items and creates these really interesting platforming situations. I played Mr. Platformer by Terry Cavanaugh, which kind of deconstructs some of the central pleasures. And the best platformer I played last year, I didn't talk about it in my best video, it was just outside the top 5, but was Leap Year, which really asks some interesting questions about how height of jump and height of landing might affect what you can do. You begin to look at the traditional platformer screen differently when the height of your jump matters so dramatically. Excellent, excellent platformer. Even this year, I've played some good platformers. Penny's Big Breakaway has a fantastic moveset and great aesthetics. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom is a kind of like Gonzo Sonic game. It focuses on speed and jumping through getting air by going off ramps, but with a kind of wild style and some wild moves you can pull off. It also combines Crazy Taxi into this, some elements of that. And the best platform I've played, I just finished it, is called Fall Structure. This is a platformer where you're trying to get down from a really high place. So you're platforming to descend, and actually your biggest enemy is momentum on your way down. You use jumps not just to go between platforms, but to steady yourself. Jumping becomes a means of control so that you don't fall too quickly or too far. It's an excellent platformer. These are all really cool that I just mentioned, but admittedly, like I said, they're not at the center of my gaming life anymore, which is fine. You know, genres have a history. They do not last forever. I also really like Astrobot's predecessor, Astrobot Rescue Mission, which is a VR game that I played in 2018. That one was so fascinating to me because it put my body into the game space, in the VR. It gave me a whole new relationship to embodiment. I'm tethered to my little guy, my little Astrobot, and I'm in the space. And it had, very simple platforming and spectacle, but it served this different sense of embodiment. It didn't get in the way. It was a really focused and constrained game for VR. The main constraint was really my body, my neck, where I could look. That was the camera. This new embodiment brought new platforming pleasures. Perception itself felt kind of new, light and dark, near and far. I was experiencing these in a platformer in a different way. I've often with platformers had this future feeling, after Super Mario Brothers, after Mario 64, the world seemed wide open. Where else can this go? And I felt this in Astrobot Rescue Mission too, that there was this future feeling, but also this anxiety because I know what often happens with video games. I know what video games do. Video games capitalize on success, emphasis on the capital. They domesticate an original game's wilder tendencies, kind of bring it into line with other games, with the genre, with a corporate IP. They make sequel after sequel, more and more, repeating and supposedly improving until there's no juice from the original concept left. But while I worried about this with Astrobot Rescue Mission, what I didn't anticipate was that they would actually devolve the game. That in capitalizing and domesticating it, they would take away the very thing, this new embodiment, these new perceptions and sensations, and reduce it to this, what we have now, Astrobot. Plain Astrobot. Astrobot is now so basic, so regressive, so hell-bent on delighting me to death, that, stripped of its VR charms, what is left behind is just a bad platformer. What do I mean by a bad platformer? I mean that Astrobot is a single solution platformer. A single solution platformer, kind of cousin to the single solution puzzles that I hate. It's all locks and keys, no true abilities. Every tool you get is fit exactly to the world, designed exactly for its use. They appear just when you need them and disappear right after. Use and discard, never save, never build upon, never think about what to do, never choose. Each item or ability creates this kind of forced syncing with the machine, with the platform level. Everything is so conscriptive. Astrobot feels like it's from the same lineage as, games like Mother May I and Simon Says. Astrobot has 100 ways to say, follow my rhythm exactly, just like that asshole in Whiplash. I'm always just wanting to say, give me some space, man. This is really developer-centered design, even company-centered, not player-centered. This is not really game design exactly. It's certainly not good platformer design, but instead it's a kind of contraption design, a kind of clockwork design, meaning that it treats the players as automatons, not little virtual people. Another way to put this is that it's a binary platformer versus maybe something like a gradient platformer, a spectrum or physics platformer, or even a multivalent platformer. It's a binary platform, an excruciating binary. Yes or no, on or off, alive or dead, no attrition, no room for error. You do it right or you don't do it at all. There's no actual player expression in this binary, no wiggle room, no room for you, zero agency. I felt like I'm just not necessary while I'm playing. I'm a spectator, not a player. Someone who watches and goes along with the relentlessly cutesy bullying. There's no flexibility or suppleness or room to breathe. There's so little felt embodiment even. It's just a series of tricks, one right way to do everything. Really, it's barely a platformer at all. It often just feels like an elaborate QuickTime event. I half expected there to be screen prompts for every interaction. Triangle, square, left trigger, right trigger. This, now this, jump here, duck here, hold, release. Feels related to me to a kind of platforming I think of as just-in-time platforming, where the world is constantly rising and falling, deforming itself, bending over backwards, sometimes literally, based on what it needs you to do. This just-in-time platforming, you can see it in Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, a game I know many people loved, but I really did not. Just-in-time platforming gives the world a kind of unavoidable sequence, a narrow way forward, a one-way street. So full of tricks that these, just-in-time sequences make it hard to backtrack and see what you miss. The secrets in Astrobot, secrets should be a joy, but I felt they were a burden. I felt this constant anxiety whenever I missed one of the little guys. Because I was like, oh man, I do not want to go back through the motions of this level again. These exact motions. Even Sonic and its kind of tunnel vision has more flexibility than Astrobot. Even the original Super Mario Bros. Was much more open. It had a more complex possibility space. And that was a game you literally couldn't go backwards on its screen. I think a huge factor in all of this is the bad controls. Platformers live or die based on their controls, and Astrobot is so weightless. The controls are so responsive, but in a fidgety way. They're too responsive. You turn on a dime in a way that no body can. There's no sense of momentum or weight, the kind that Mario has and has had from the beginning. The jumping too is not good. It cheats with a kind of built-in hover. And then when you try to make a longer jump, I always felt like my jumps were almost magnetized to the landing. I would fudge the landings. I wasn't sure if I could make it, and I would land as if magnetized to the platform. Platformers are not even just about jumping, but about how to land well. But this game doesn't want you to worry about that. It doesn't want you to worry about anything but having fun. And it was this insistence on fun, this kind of mandated joy, that made the bad platforming all the more insufferable to me. I felt the game constantly saying to me, smile, goddammit. It was so frantic, so chirpy, almost spastic, so afraid of me getting bored or looking away, when I was bored the whole time. The world of Astrobot is so in the thrall of some permanent sugar high. It can't sit still, and you can't really either. You're always pushed forward. It's a world constantly performing for you, like a theater person who won't stop acting and showing off. It's exhausting. All this showing off, this virtuosity, it's not serving the gameplay, but instead it serves its own self-image, its own kind of cutesy vanity. Really its own corporate project. There's no real engagement with its engine, its physics. There's only tricks, buttons and levers. It's so frustrating to constantly show off object handling, its physics, to no end in the game. There's no meaningful integration of any of these hardware tricks with the gameplay. It's all just flourishes and doodads and distractions. And for all this performance, hardware and software, there's no actual drama in Astrobot. There's no journey. There's no sense of distance. Everything's all sliced up. Death by 1,000 checkpoints. It's all spectacle and pageantry, gimmicks to hide that it's just a collection of very basic moves. Overwhelming, but so shallow. I'm not against spectacle, but this is a kind of restrictive, oppressive spectacle. It's not a rich, expressive spectacle like in Black Myth Wukong. It's not a demanding but generous spectacle like that game. Astrobot's a cold, calculating spectacle. There's nothing here but polish. It feels like a total misuse of surfaces, and there's no identity beneath. It's explicitly like this. It celebrates its own shallowness and blandness, its ability to take on any Sony mascot, just as an expression of its, corporate aesthetics, its corporate power. I heard some call it, a love letter to Sony or to PlayStation. And I just thought, gross. Gross. This joy has been trademarked. This platformer is built on decades of platforming greats and has nothing new, nothing real to add. It's a cover band at best, technically proficient on the surface, but glib and artistically void. And it actually even seems to misunderstand its own genre. This game is just all theme park pastiche. It's been designed to death. It feels airless and rigid, and I actually feel bad afterwards when I play it. My nerves are frayed. I really wanted to enjoy this. I played Astrobot because I loved Rescue Mission, and part of me still gets excited by platformers. But level after level, this was just the most joyless game experience I had last year. It was so weird for me to hear others talk about the joy of this game. I couldn't understand this. I felt none of that. I liked maybe 2 levels in the whole game. There was a big and small one that was kind of fun to play around in, and there was a day-night one. If I'm remembering correctly, it's been a year since I played this, and I'm definitely not going to go back and check. Where I think you would press like a day-night button, and the level would kind of turn on its side. That one was kind of interesting. But the rest was so flat to me, so uninspired, so obligatory, so nothing. I really had to force myself to keep playing even, always hoping something worthwhile was just around the corner. Maybe if my daughter could play with me, maybe I would have had a different time. She's not old enough yet, though, and I showed her the game and she was not engaged by what she saw. Maybe if I had a different history with platformers, or if I sought different things in them, I could enjoy this. But I do have a history, a long one, and I do seek embodiment and expressive movement and spaces to inhabit. And so I just don't enjoy this at all. This leaves my worst game of last year, the game I actually cared about, and that was Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now, the original Final Fantasy VII is, to me, one of the best games of all time, still to this day. I came to it at a time of great uncertainty for me in college. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But despite its importance to me, I was open to this remake trilogy. The first game, Final Fantasy VII Remake, really surprised me. It was not just a faithful, updated, high-definition retelling of the original. It did not leave the original as a kind of settled thing. The remake of its title wasn't even a noun. It was more of a verb, to remake. The potential transgression of that, to remake something. And by the end of that game, you're fighting fate to change things going forward. This was really exciting to me. I felt like the game was really trying to kind of work out its status as a remake and a kind of sequel. It made me wonder, are all remakes actually kinds of sequels? And the game felt wide open by the end after you fought fate. I thought also fighting fans, the fandom, really pushing back against the traditionalists. And it felt like anything could happen going forward. So before I get to all that did happen, I want to mention a few high points, because like I said, this was not a uniformly dull game to me, like Astrobot. There were some real high points here. First, the character writing was great. It was great in Remake, it's great here. The character interactions, especially Tifa and Aerith, especially Tifa and Barrett. Barrett benefits a lot from the writing. Tifa is just wonderful here. Tifa was always my favorite in the original, and here they really capture how she's warm and kind and also a bruiser. Her fighting style is so intimate and sincere. She means it. And I really think they captured Tifa the way that her warmth and caring is a path to revolution. There's not just anger or revenge. She has all the reasons for that. But her desire for revolution is based in her kindness, in her caring for others, in her warmth. The voice actress is excellent, and she contributes a lot to this. Her face now, it all brings it together. It's excellent. The whole game has this warmth, actually. It's not just Tifa. There's a lot of warmth in it. There's a lot of humor, a lot of goofiness, true to the original. And there's just a lot of tonal variety, actually. It's not one-note game like Astrobot. Astrobot, despite being an apparent smorgasbord, was really one note. This has a great deal of variety in its tone, in its activities. In particular, I really liked Queen's Blood. I loved its status as like an in-world game, that it was a part of pop culture in this world, binding diverse people together, and also kind of refracting some of the anxieties. If there's monsters in the world and you put them in cards and make a game out of them to kind of make those monsters more manageable, made sense to me. And the game itself I just enjoyed. This game of controlling a very tight space. I did every match possible of Queen's Blood, played every person in the world all the way until the end. So over my 100 hours, there were some good times. Less and less as it went on, or maybe those good times just mattered less to me as everything went increasingly wrong. And I'm not going to go through every little thing that I dislike about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm not going to get kind of lost in the weeds with that. Its size almost feels like it acts as a bulwark against criticism. There's just so much. Instead, I want to talk about the three worst things for me. Those things were the world, the multiverse, and the ending. So first, the world. After you leave Midgar at the end of the first game, my mind was really alive with possibilities. The world you're about to step into, out from under the steel sky of Midgar, it could have been anything. But it was this. It was a Ubisoft-style open world. It was instantly familiar to me, and thus instantly exhausting and boring. I thought, we fought fate for this? It's like as if Ubisoft model of an open world is the fate of all video game worlds. The Ubisoft model is just a really bad fit here, even beyond the usual kind of Ubi reasons. This is a game about saving the literal planet as an eco-terrorist. So a world that is fundamentally a checklist to satisfy the completionist in you, a world that is overrun with icons for your convenience, an approach that is based in an exploitation model of the world. This is all completely at odds with Avalanche, with your mission. Are we really going to make use of the planet? Hoover up all the resources, even these eruptions of the live stream? Are we going to suck it dry in order to save it? It feels like I'm actually working for Shinra or something. And this is kind of obvious that this model doesn't work, this contradiction. But I think the very feel of the world of Rebirth is off in less obvious ways. For instance, the graphics. It's not just that it doesn't look good, that it looks, busy, jumbled, jittery, like a bunch of assets thrown together, hyper detailed, but all separate and flat. It kind of reminded me of the look of Horizon Zero Dawn, which I also didn't think was a very convincing world. But it's not even just a matter of the graphics being good or bad, or even aesthetic judgments about them. To me, what matters is the consequences of those graphics. With games, I think we really need to talk more about the consequences of graphics, not the just good or bad of them. What is the consequence of all the detail in this world? Not rich, bespoke detail, but a kind of standardized detail, hyper detail. What is the consequence of this much noise in each object, all on top of each other, stretching, in every direction? Well, for one, I think one consequence is that it throws our sense of scale off. Detail reduces scale. It reduces the felt world size, brings everything closer to our scale. We live in this detailed scale. So everything feels in the game like it's too close up, too standardized at this one scale of detail. This goes for us, our party, our avatars too. On screen, we are both extremely detailed and we are standardized. We are very medium-sized. In fact, everything in Rebirth's world feels medium-sized to me. Not too big or too small, but just right. Just for you. Your size on screen determines the size of everything else in relation to your avatar. And this ends up making the world feel strangely small. It's not about the actual size of the world, but the experience of its size. The relentless detail, the standardization, the mediumness, this all reduces the felt size of the world to me. I think with a game world, what we want is something beyond us. That world feel, that world building in our mind. The kind that makes us feel smaller, feel vulnerable in a landscape. An actual world is always threatening to overwhelm us. But a uniform, standardized mediumness, it neutralizes this overwhelm. It domesticates the world and makes it flat and consistent. And this is another consequence of Rebirth's graphics to me, this flatness and consistency. When I move across the world here, I don't feel like my party's really there in the landscape. This flat, consistent feeling is contrary to any real sense of embodiment. What I feel instead is the logic of a menu. This world, despite all its detail and the seeming opening up, it's like an illustrated menu. A menu laid out in space, as space, but still fundamentally a menu, a giant menu. It's not a menu overlaid on a world, but a world overlaid on menus. It's all too legible. It all makes too much sense, like a spreadsheet. Rebirth's world just has this really deflating consistency. It's deadening, almost terrifyingly consistent. Even the lack of a day or night cycle adds to this consistency, this frozen, flat world. I know consistency and legibility, these can sound like good things, but I think they can be a real threat to the feeling of a world. A world is the thing that cannot be apprehended in its entirety. It is not consistent enough for this. It is not legible in this way. Every way in which you know a world is undercut by everything you don't know, by this fundamental incompleteness, by even almost a kind of wrongness. You sense a world and you know that you're wrong. I sometimes think that world feel is the feeling of being wrong. It's the feeling of your own limits, your own constraints, your fundamental smallness and minoreness. And Rebirth's world has none of this world feel. I think if we compare Rebirth's approach to world to the 1997 original's approach, the difference is really, really striking. I mean, as a remake, it does invite this comparison. The original Final Fantasy VII was not uniform, or standardized, or medium-sized. It was not hyper-detailed and flat. It was not always legible, and it was definitely not consistent. The original game existed at so many different scales. There were battle screens. There were hundreds of dioramas of widely varying scales, many of them from odd angles. And besides the battle screens and all of these diorama screens, you had an overworld, which was a kind of living map, an abstracted space that you could move through, that resonated with possibilities as you moved across it. In fact, I think zooming in and out, seeing at different scales, like the original did, it gives a stronger contrast between your character and the world, a kind of dynamic sense of large characters and large personalities who are yet small on a planetary scale. It's both of these things, large and small, together. And when it just comes to, knowing the world itself, working at multiple scales expands the world. You know that no one view is sufficient. So you have to work between those views in that insufficiency of your knowledge to kind of expand out and create this world feeling. I think it's worth saying here that these limited views and multiple scales of the original game were not a failure of graphics or technology at the time. And they aren't just artifacts now or quirky retro charms either. They are technical constraints put towards extraordinary artistic ends. These constraints created an aesthetic in the original that prized multiple viewpoints over a single perspective, that sought destabilization and incompleteness over consistency and legibility, that valued fragments over wholes. Final Fantasy VII gave you the world in pieces, in fragments, and asked you to put it back together again, to make it whole in your mind. Every painted scene, as you would pathfind, through these dioramas at different scales, an overwhelming number to reconcile. All of these made a world. As you awkwardly moved your little puppet through them, there's nothing smooth about it, really. The world wasn't fit to you. It resisted you, even visually. There was no consistency in either its world or its character models. But that was its beauty, its own version of realism. Many other games did versions of this in that awkward early 3D era. But we can see more easily now the virtues of not having some terrifyingly consistent visual language. What made Final Fantasy VII stand out back then was how this fragmented approach fit thematically. The planet was being torn apart and you had to put it back together. Your main character's own inner world was shattered. Cloud was totally unreliable, full of lies. And so you as Cloud had to eventually piece your inner world back together too, more truthfully, even at the cost of great pain and loss. And this approach, this fragmented, incomplete approach, multiple viewpoints, it's not just bound to the hardware limitations. Fragmentation and multiple perspectives simultaneously even is it's a very thrilling aesthetic choice. You can look at something like Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, 10 years before Final Fantasy VII. It used an overhead map and a side view to create this sense of Hyrule, and neither one was the true Hyrule, right? Both were valid. Neither one could claim a kind of, ontological superiority. Hyrule was seen in both views, and you put them together to create Hyrule in your mind. Even last year, A Ranger, one of my favorite games I didn't talk about in my video, but it took comic panels and made it a part of its overhead view landscape. Not just separate storytelling scenes, but actually part of the landscape, different views within the overhead view. So that that you're never really seeing reality, that false promise of photorealism in motion, the holodeck made real. The whole is only in your mind, and it is always provisional, always incomplete. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's world, though, it feels always known. It is detailed and final. It's segmented, not fragmented. It's not composed of varying perspectives. It's a samey whole. Its size is completely standardized, only cut up into slices so as to be doled out over its elaborate story. This world was all so uninspiring, so familiar as a modern player, so aesthetically flat and small. It just didn't feel like a world to me, and it certainly didn't feel like a world worth saving. Okay, now the second aspect of Rebirth that I felt made it so bad was the multiverse. After Remake, I thought there were two timelines. There was the original, Final Fantasy VII, and this trilogy. Two timelines, competing with each other. But then in the middle of Rebirth, Sephiroth sets you straight. Nope, it's a multiverse. I remember thinking, when he told me that, God damn it, not another multiverse. It's not that I don't think a multiverse can work for some stories. It can be even hard to avoid with time travel stories. But I think the use of a multiverse has to be either very limited, using it for a metaphor or a character study, or just having a few realities, or some really hard rules that make many realities too hard to access. So it either needs to be very limited, or the multiverse has to be very serious, meaning all of its endlessly proliferating universes are equal. Each reality in the multiverse needs to have an equal metaphysical weight. No primes, no sacred timelines, no easy reconciliations that imply the subordination of certain universes to others. And usually, in that subordination, their annihilation. For me, this is just one of the prime dangers of multiverses in stories, this lack of equality across realities. It's one thing to be attached to your own reality, or maybe the next one over, if you're trying to change something. But it's very easy to slip into a kind of multiverse solipsism, where yours is the only really real one, and everyone else in every other universe is secretly, or overtly, less real. I know I've used this word solipsism a number of times in this video, in talking about reading Genesis, Daniel Tiger. This is a consistent concern for me, solipsism, and it's something I plan to talk about more in an upcoming video. Anyway, this sort of multiverse solipsism problem, it's all over Rebirth. But it's also combined with one of the other big dangers of multiverse thinking, which is fandom. So how does fandom come into this? Well, I think that once you invoke the multiverse, it puts you at a kind of remove from everything, a meta remove, really. Characters get wobbly, often very unstable. Storylines proliferate and become hard to manage. Story and world logic themselves begin to untangle. Things fall apart. Very literally, the center will not hold. And your whole narrative can just quickly begin to border on meaninglessness. So, what rules, what logic is there in a multiverse of infinite possibilities? Where do you look to work out the story problems? On what basis should any one thing happen over another? I think of the long history of comics, of Marvel movies now, of video games too. And I think one of the main answer to these questions is fandoms. Where do you look for a multiverse? By what logic do you solve any storytelling problems? A fan's logic. The danger is not necessarily the actual fandom, though sometimes it is, but I'm talking here about the fandom in creators' minds. The reception, the expectations, the likely reactions, the desire to please. And I think this is just plain ruinous for a game, for a narrative, for any work of art. And to be clear, I just don't think that the multiverse was inevitable after Remake. Once you introduce multiple timelines or realities, it can feel like a very logical next step to go from 2 realities to 3 to infinity. But you can repeat stories or diverge from canon without invoking an entire multiverse. You don't actually have to go there, even if it's implied. You can resist this, big brain galaxy move, especially when the multiverse is so overused at this point, and dangerous, like I just said. Now, this whole multiverse issue kind of remains unresolved at the moment, since the 3rd game is not out yet. I don't know where they're going with all this. But the multiverse does directly impact my 3rd and biggest problem with the game, which is the ending. So this last part is going to be a little different than everything that's come before it. When I first tried to record this about the ending, it was about an hour and a half long. Just this part, almost as long as everything that's come before it, if you could believe it. I think I was just trying to include everything. I had way too many notes, and I just had too much to say and struggled with how to say it. I am new to YouTube. I'm new to not only how to record myself, but what works at what length. I'm still trying to figure this out. I think the problem is that Final Fantasy VII is simply something I love so much that I just find it really difficult to talk about. There's nothing I've talked about in these 2 videos that I love the way I love Final Fantasy VII, or as long, like 28 years now. When I love something, and when I'm criticizing something else, like Rebirth, in light of that love, I get really detailed. Like I said, I had so many notes, pages and pages of notes, not only about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's ending, but I went back and took notes on this scene in the original, and just, I've had a lot of thoughts over the years. When you love something, I think you become afraid of not doing it justice. It feels risky. There was just something about it that wasn't working. I think one thing that has really come to light with playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is I feel like I misread its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII Remake. In that game, I was really, as I said before, really surprised at how it seemed to push back against fans. That it seemed to, in Fighting Fate, say, all bets are off. We're not going to be faithful. We're not going to do what you want us to do. But having played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is almost slavish in its attention to the sequence of the original, the events of the original, it really, up until the very end, it's all too faithful, far more than I thought when I played Remake. And what I thought, I guess, was a refusal of fans has turned out with Rebirth to be an overwhelming engagement. I mean, I think Rebirth is just filthy with fandom. Its concerns, who it's paying attention to, who it's responding to, who it imagines. It's got this sickness in it, this fan sickness. I think also I hesitated with what to say because the ending is such a setup for the third and final game in this remake trilogy. And so it's hard to say things, especially the way this ends, when there's so much unknown. And I guess because I felt so wrong about Remake in light of Rebirth, there's, of course, is that chance with the next one that this will change my mind about this. Probably not that much, but, some things could be different. I put all those notes aside, and I'm just going to speak kind of unprepared. Try to get at just what I hate about this ending in brief. First, it just feels like such a cowardly ending. The end of Rebirth does not have Aerith die, as in the original, or live exactly. It chooses both and neither. She appears to be dead to the party, to Tifa and Barrett and everyone, and to Cloud. She seems to be alive, or he thinks that. With the multiverse going on here, what's in Cloud's mind and what's in reality, it's hard to tell. But my entire feeling watching this, now this case of a kind of Schrodinger's Aerith, alive and dead both, who can say? It just felt so cowardly. It felt like the whole game didn't want to decide, didn't want to say yet. Not that they haven't figured this out, but when they reach this probably most famous scene in all of gaming, they kind of refused. We've been teased through the entire game. I mean, not just the fates of Remake, but here, the title, Rebirth, is constantly teasing us about Aerith. And then at the end, it is to be continued. And it just felt deeply so cowardly. I'm not sure what they're could be going for here. Why they did this. At least I can't figure out a reason that's a good reason. I can think of reasons. And all the possibilities seem kind of bad to me. Even in the best case scenario, that Cloud, our unreliable narrator, is either just in denial still, as he was in much of the original game until this point, or if the multiverse is real, but Cloud has kind of, taken Sephiroth's suggestion of a multiverse and run with it to make it not real to him. Whatever the case is, this extension of Cloud's denial, this prolonging of his feelings coming forward, which was the most powerful part of the original, I just can't square it. I just can't make it not make sense. I mean, if the multiverse isn't real, if he's just in denial, we have to go back and look at everything that happened. I'm not going to replay either game. If it's something else, and this is even just some sort of elaborate metaphor for grief, the unreality of grief, the way that we live in both worlds when we lose someone, the world before and the world after, and how just unbearable that is. I don't know. I feel like because this game is so focused on the fans, that here in the end, what it is playing with Cloud, with this dead and not dead, it feels like it is positioning us as players to be those fans who don't want her to die. Which I'm not. I'm not one of those fans. Again, the fandom here, I can't stand that the game's concern is more with this scene in its place, kind of almost in video game history. It's standing outside of it. It has this distance from it. You know, the original scene was you were in it with Cloud. Here, I feel like we're aligned with Sephiroth. Sephiroth is, above it all and kind of, enjoying watching everybody suffer from a distance, a meta remove. That's what multiverse, that's what remakes can do, right? And it just feels like teasing the fandom about Aerith through Cloud. It just feels so false and ugly and kind of pathetic. It's hard to consider fans who would still want Aerith to live and take that seriously. Wanting Aerith to live, the character, is just childish. I mean, and as far as we care about these characters, sure, you want her to live. You want Tifa and Aerith and Tifa and Cloud and everyone to not suffer. In the fiction, yeah. But here, in our multiverse, in this meta remove in the remake world, are you kidding? Is that something to take seriously? Games so often put us in this position that I feel is so condescending and so just assuming things about us. It's like in The Last of Us Part 2 when the game assumed we would be so enraged by what happens to Joel that we would go along with Ellie. So they could make this big point, this very simplistic, basic-ass point about revenge that I was never on board with. Games do this all the time. Condescend, Chadley in this game is probably the best representative of it. What they assume about us, and the denial that's being assumed here, that we didn't accept Aerith's death long ago. I don't know. Denial to me is the default state of gaming. It's no wonder that, it feeds right into, conservative fascist politics. Denial. And then, of course, taking on this ending with the unknown of it, that we don't know what is real. We don't know what to feel. We have to wait until part 3. So anything we say is, subject to being wrong, to being foolish, it reminds me of that ridiculous Kojima quote from Metal Gear Solid 5 when, people saw Quiet and were like, why is she dressed that way? Why is she so naked? And he said, when you find out the reason, you will be ashamed of your thoughts and deeds, something like that. God, please. Oh, Lord. The stuff that we, think about in gaming is insane. No, once we found out, it was stupid and I was ashamed of nothing. Ashamed. Anyway, I'm going to talk about my feelings here at this ending, risking the shame of these thoughts and feelings. How did I feel while watching the ending of Rebirth? Well, first, like I just said, I felt confused. Annoyingly confused. Not just confused about what happened. Did she die or not? How is the multiverse working? What is real? But confused about how I'm supposed to feel about it. Because when I don't know what's quite real, I don't know how to feel. Not in a denial sense, but in a just genuine, confusion. Huh? The scene doesn't even play out in a way that is, it's purposefully kind of flinches. It doesn't show things exactly. This happened this year too, and I'll talk about this at the end of the year with an event that happens in Death Stranding 2 that is just so poorly shot and directed to try to misdirect you that it's not even believable the first time. You're like, this is not clear in a basic cinematography way. And this idea that I'm confused about even how I'm supposed to feel is just really, really off-putting. After the confusion, of course, you have to fight 3 bosses in a row that take an hour. alongside Zack, alongside Aerith, who steps back in, confusing things further, in a whatever it's doing in the story is just feels like fan service. Just feels like fan service. I didn't like fighting Sephiroth at the end of Remake, but here it's just so obnoxious. It's so long. It's so exhausting, so bombastic, and to have this epic hour-long battle, longer if you ever die, after a confusing scene of Aerith's death, non-death, is just exhaustion is going lightly. The whole game is exhausting. It's not a surprise they did it here, but my God. Who thought this was a good idea? Why you have to have a boss battle here? And there was one in the original. It lasted maybe 5 minutes at most. Yeah. And the fan service on top of it. It just feels gross. And this leads to the final feeling I had after the fighting, when you're kind of left with the party and Cloud seems like a psycho next to the party. And maybe intentionally. I mean, I guess intentionally. It's not unintentional, but... And I just felt, watching the end sequence play out, I felt disgust. Disgusted at these choices. Disgust that the feelings are all at a remove. I'm with Tifa, to be real. I'm feeling with her. And this distance that it's creating, whatever lesson has to impart later, it just feels gross, and I feel disgusted. And I'm especially disgusted that ultimately what this proves to be, what this whole end sequence is, it's said in the lines that the game directly addresses the player. No promises await at Journey's End, after Cloud has made a promise, to Aerith, I got this. That delusion. That direct address, no promises await at Journey's End. What it means is that Aerith's death or not death is now an advertisement for the sequel. The most famous scene, and famous because it's moving, scene in gaming, has become a cliffhanger. And not just like a cliffhanger, what happens next, but an emotional cliffhanger. I don't even know how to feel. And as a cliffhanger, an advertisement for the exciting sequel. And it's nasty. That's gross. No. You know what I loved in the original was actually not for me even about Aerith's death. Aerith's death was spoiled for me. My friend Shane imported the game 6 months before it came here. And on spring break, I came home from college, and he showed me Aerith's death. I didn't know who Aerith was. And I wasn't mad, and I'm not mad to this day, because I had fallen out of gaming, sort of, and Shane showing me that scene in Final Fantasy VII brought me back into gaming. That summer I saved money so I could buy a PlayStation, so I could play this game in the fall. That and Mario 64 got me back in after a few years out of gaming. So Aerith was never the point to me. Aerith died. I've seen characters die before her. Shane and I loved Phantasy Star 2. And not playing that down, her death, I'm just saying that for me, the scene wasn't even about that. There were so many things that I loved in the original. And this scene is one of them, but there were other things too. Cloud himself, Cloud the Liar. There are so many shocks in the original game when you're first playing it about who Cloud is. There's a photograph that's like crazy when you see the real thing. Who he tries to be. Who the real hero, what happened to Zack. Not a heroic standoff, but a body in the ground riddled with bullets. There is crazy stuff that happens in the original game that was just shocking to me and exciting. And this unreliable narrator, which I knew from writing, from fiction, but not in games much. But I love this scene, not because of just the emotion of Aerith dying, but because of the party and specifically Cloud's reaction, which is what's intentionally missing here in Rebirth's version of this. Cloud, after she dies, he has a breakthrough. He's been lying so much. He's been in denial about who he is. And when Sephiroth starts monologuing about the planet and his plan, Cloud says, "Shut up. Shut up." He says, I'm going to try to remember this correctly, your stupid plan doesn't mean anything. Aerith is gone. She'll no longer laugh. She'll no longer get angry. I loved that. I remember, she'll no longer get angry. We miss people's anger too. And he says, what about us, the people left behind? What are we supposed to do? And then he says, what is this pain? My fingers are tingling. My mouth is dry. My eyes are burning. His body, he is feeling it in a different way. This body that, swings that Buster Sword with ease is telling him something, and he's listening. My eyes are burning. It's so shocking and powerful in that moment to see this closed person cracked open. And not just, these powerful scenes are not the CG, not the impressive, though beautiful scenes of Cloud laying her to rest afterwards or things like that. It is the little puppet view. I say puppet because this is the words that, Sephiroth uses. But it is the low polygon, blocky, your little Cloud avatar who is shaking on the screen, who is holding Aerith, also a little puppet. He is the one saying, what is this feeling? And when all of it's over and they're gonna lay Aerith to rest, you see them in their little blocky avatar view. These little guys. They say goodbye. Tifa, the way she does it, she bends down, little blocky polygon. Tifa, she bends down and she fixes Aerith's hair. It's a little movement. She holds her face before she's overcome and runs away. And Cloud picks her up. I remember this, that when it's not Cloud in CG picking her up, it's little polygon Cloud holding little polygon Aerith, carrying her. In the scene, Sephiroth tells Cloud that he's a puppet. Now, we know in the story that Cloud is literally a puppet because he has Genova cells in him. He's been forced to do things he doesn't want to do against his will. And we know it's true too because not just, a puppet in the story or a puppet of, the creators, we're moving Cloud too. He's our puppet, kind of literally, the way avatars work. This is a kind of, meta moment. Even in the midst of this, you're a puppet, and you gotta admit, oh, yeah, Cloud, you are kind of our puppet. But it's not overstated, right? And it works because we, too, are feeling with Cloud. The loss of Aerith, but we're feeling his feeling, we're feeling for him, with him. And this little puppet on the screen, little puppet Cloud holding little puppet Aerith, a puppet carrying a puppet. I remember being so moved by that then, and still, when I watched it again, preparing all my notes on this, it's still a puppet carrying a puppet. Our puppet. And us, that distinction of avatar and player, it's not clear. Feeling a puppet ourselves. I felt like a puppet back then too. I still do sometimes. Not in control of myself, not just so many things pulling at me. So many things, so many people. The people I care about. The people I carry me. I'm not free. Cloud's not free as a puppet, not free from any of this. What is this pain? When I played this game in college, I was in college. I held, like Cloud, so much in. I wasn't who I thought I was. I didn't know how to express it. I come from a family, very loving, but kind of relentlessly positive. Don't get me wrong, it has its benefits for sure, but it's hard to talk about darker feelings in a positive environment like that. I'm from Kentucky and was raised as a boy in the South where feelings are not to be shown like that. Not exactly you're meant to be the strong silent type, but it's kinda. It's not. You can't show everything. You're not sure what you can even feel. When I was in college there, college was a cold place to me. Intellectually very stimulating, but a cold place. I had good friends, but it was the life of the mind there. It was not the life of the heart. Definitely not the life of the body. In the body, even back then, it was that very year of Final Fantasy VII, I began to develop like psychosomatic kind of reactions to stress and anxiety, and psychosomatic reactions I have to this day. I was also 2 years out from a relationship that had ended that I still hadn't gotten over. Had cried all my tears 2 years before and hadn't cried in 2 years when Final Fantasy VII came. And when it came, I cried not for Aerith exactly, but for Cloud and for myself. Like Cloud, I was slowly coming into my own feelings. Through loss, through pain, through trying to be honest. It seems so simple, owning your feelings, treating them as real. But for me, and for Cloud, and I think for many others, it's not so easy. It's still hard, actually. I don't know why media, books and shows and games allow me to feel things that I have trouble feeling in everyday life, or at least fully feeling and admitting to. But I just access feelings in a way with media and need them in ways I still don't fully understand. I wasn't alone playing Final Fantasy VII. My brother was beside me. He was my partner, my witness to all of this. And he was much younger than me. He's 7 years younger. He was in middle school when I was in college. And this really bound us to each other. It was the beginning of a close relationship that has persisted to this day. Final Fantasy VII did that. In that fall, Evangelion also we watched together. We listened to OK Computer. And these things, these media, they bound us to each other. They let us feel things together and express things. And like I said, this is still true for me today. So I guess here at the end of all this, thinking back on Final Fantasy VII in light of Rebirth, I can't stand that this game chose fandom over feelings. That it chose meta games, multiverse bullshit, advertisement over real feelings. And yeah, maybe they'll have a breakthrough. I hope to God they do this in the next one. Aerith's certainly not going to come back, right? But assuming even they do this, that they kicked that can down the road and left us here with this exhausting, confusing, disgusting ending. These dark feelings we have, of course, these worsts, right? These feelings I have about media that I dislike, that I hate. These are real feelings too. I think Cloud's original question was right. What about us? What are we supposed to do? What is this pain? I know people feel silly sometimes asking about pain with media, with art, with unreal things, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's real. My fingers are tingling. My mouth is dry. My eyes. My eyes are burning. Because our pain, our anger, our disgust, our refusal, saying no, fuck off, this cowardly bullshit. These feelings about games, about art, about stories, about characters, these are real too. Our sadness, especially our sadness. Talking about sadness in games, oh man, so many conversations to be had. All these feelings are real. And I think we should express them. I think we should talk about them. Like Cloud once did. Okay, I'm going to have to end it there and move on for now. If you made it this far, thank you. I'm definitely going to have to do my best, my next bests and worsts of 2025 this year a little differently. Impose some serious constraints on myself and to make it more manageable, not take so long. The next few videos I'll be doing will be shorter, more focused on one thing. Not super short, but under an hour. I want to do these once a month, and these best and worst are a little different animal, but yeah. So the next video, it will be about the book series that dominated my spring of this year, Dungeon Crawler Carl. Not just my experience reading Carl, but the context in which I read them, that being the early months of the second Trump administration. So I'm going to be talking about not only the series, but how reading Carl feels in 2025. Okay, that's it for now. Take care out there. And as always, thank you for listening.